Welcome back to the Budget Gamer channel, where we bring you critical and in-depth reviews of just about every indie game we can get our hands on, and today we're going to be taking a look at Sword of the Guardian for the Nintendo Switch. But despite the obvious heavy inspirations from classics like Golden Axe, you may be surprised at what you actually get for the $15 price tag. Sword of the Guardian is a game modeled after the classic 2D side-scrolling beat-em-up genre, so expectedly there's probably not going to be a super stellar story to go along with it. And while any fans of the classic beat-em-up genre probably wouldn't really expect much, we would expect something. But as far as we can tell from actually playing the game, at least reading all the dialogue for the first 4 chapters, there's apparently some bad dude doing some bad stuff to good people, and it's up to a group of 3 people that we know nothing about to probably stop him. And in all honesty, that's about as much as you're gonna get. But like I said, this game is a beat 'em up, so the story really shouldn't be that pivotal in deciding whether this is a good game or not. Getting into the actual gameplay though, once you pass the title screen, you'll be allowed to select one of 3 playable characters. And each of the unique characters, whether it's the dwarf, the monk, or the swordsman, will have their own unique attributes and combat styles, which more or less resolves itself into the dwarf being the tanky character, the swordsman more being the all-arounder, and the monk being the high-speed combo junkie. And on that note, one of the unique characteristics the game does boast is that each character has its own unique combos. So instead of merely mashing the attack button until you've managed to destroy all enemies in your way, the game provides the player with a series of moves such as uppercuts, dash attacks, and other ways to juggle enemy characters, in addition to the ever-popular special attack. And though a flurry of blows from any one of these 3 playable characters might be enough to vanquish the individual foe, should you find yourself getting overwhelmed by an enemy swarm, this special attack will blast all enemies in the general area. But if the quick combos and charge attacks don't provide quite enough battle diversity, there is actually a pretty broad range of consumable weapon items that are either dropped by enemies or found through destructible environmental objects. And these can range anywhere from throwing daggers, throwing axes, Molotov cocktails, bombs, ice and fire spells, or even the occasional ring that'll allow you to heal over time or produce a protective shield. But if you've read the game's eShop description already, or read any of the write-ups online, one of the game's biggest testaments to itself is its 3D backgrounds and its musical ambiance. So in that sense, it does seem fair that we address those 2 things. In all honesty, Sword of Guardian's backgrounds are actually something to note. They are very vivid and very diverse as you play through each of the game's 13 chapters, and in several of the chapters there are actually elemental weather effects imposed, such as rain or fog or darkness, that do really add to the gameplay's environment and just the general feel. The music as well is just as diverse as the backgrounds, having a new soundtrack for each new chapter's environments, but in all honesty it does seem a bit average and really doesn't stand out in comparison to the game's background graphics. And if you were wondering, there actually is a reason why I keep specifically stating the game's background graphics. And that is more or less because the quality of the game's backgrounds calls every other graphic design choice into question. If the entire game had been rendered in either 16-bit or 32-bit graphics, we would almost have a kind of a nostalgic feeling of games like Ninja Turtles or even Battletoads. But because the developers put so much time and energy into developing the background scenery, it almost makes the characters' sprites and animations look a bit cartoonish. Additionally, as this game is modeled after the classic beat-em-up style, the only player expectation should really be how engaging the combat feels. You should be able to get in, select your player, and just start brawling until you get to the end of the game. But somehow, despite the low player expectations of the genre as a whole, this game doesn't really seem to meet them. And while the game does provide several unique playable characters with a half-dozen unique combos and a wide complement of enemies to brawl with, the combat just feels a bit stiff and slow and uninspired. Most of the game can pretty easily be navigated just by mashing the Y button over and over on random enemies, as well as occasionally using a consumable weapon item to clear out large groups. And while getting swarmed by massive amounts of mobs may drain a lot of your health, there's really not even an incentive to pursue extra life or health potions, as you'll merely respawn with a couple of lives at the beginning of the relatively short chapter. And while most players would even consider all of this to be completely forgivable as long as the boss fights are solid, I'm sorry to say that they're really not. At the end of each chapter, you will approach the expected boss with a massive health bar. But contrary to player expectation, though each boss is definitely visually unique, has their own dialogue and their own movesets, these movesets can be easily memorized, and even without memorizing the movesets, you can merely just dodge roll back and forth and chip away at their health without ever taking a hit. And while this tactic will definitely help you move all the way through the game in probably under 3 hours, it doesn't really make for a very satisfying gameplay. And despite all of this, we still haven't quite finished running the review gauntlet. There are several other issues, not only with the game's text, which suffers from severe localization issues, but also with the game's visuals. And while we've already made it a point to address the beauty of the high-resolution backgrounds in the forescreen in the actual combat area, there's still a lot of issues with texture pop-in, and while this might not drastically affect gameplay for most of the game, in certain areas something like a fence or an awning can block most of the actual playable area. Additionally, unlike the typical beat-em-ups where you have combat taking place in one screen, in Sword of the Guardian, you'll have to walk far to the left and the right of the visible screen in order to engage with all of the enemies. And while this wouldn't be absolutely terrible if it was a completely brawler-style game, most of your enemies later in game will have very powerful ranged attacks and are quite satisfied with attacking you while they're still off screen. And additionally, while on the same note of general combat, it seems like the player's hitbox and combat windows aren't exactly lined up to the enemy's hitbox and combat windows. Which, to put it more simply, basically means that you could line up on the enemy one way and not be able to hit them, and they could line up on you the exact same way and be able to take half of your health. And in all honesty, maybe I just don't have enough experience with beat-em-up style games, but that doesn't quite seem fair. And while I could easily go on and on talking about my experience with Sword of the Guardian, it is about time to wrap up the review. So if you enjoyed the review or found it helpful, feel free to throw me a like or a comment to show your support, and don't forget to click that little bell icon when you subscribe to stay updated with the latest content. There are new and unique indies coming out literally every single day, so there's always going to be something new to find out about right here. But since I can only cover a few reviews a week, if you want a heads up on which reviews might be covered next, you can follow us on Twitter or check out the announcements page on our new Discord channel. But anyway, this has been Budget Gamers. As always, thanks for watching.